Hello and welcome to the Hell Project. The first time of going live for several weeks, and it shows. My laptop's struggling, the technical stuff is struggling, um, but I think we're live, and hopefully you can hear what we're saying. We're going to go through Matthew 8. I'll check that the sound's working in a moment. There's about a 30-second lag going on to YouTube. I don't know if there's anything I can do to stop it from lagging, but we'll see. So Darren's with me, and as I said, we're going through Matthew 8. This is the fifth session that we've had going through Matthew in detail. It will get fairly technical. It's not going to be a cutting edge lecture or anything like that. We'll do our best to keep you engaged, but this is more Darren and I bouncing ideas around about Matthew 8 and getting really stuck in. Darren's done most of the legwork. I'll just throw in my thoughts every now and then. But do let us know if you're watching, say hello, and before we really get stuck in, I just want to recommend something that I backed on Kickstarter. They don't know that I'm doing this. I'm not paid to do this. I don't get any monetization. But Word for Word Bible comic. Look them up. It's a British guy who's a very good artist, and I think he's got a small team with him. They've done Judges, Ruth, Esther, and several other books. And now they've just released the Gospel of Matthew. And just visually impressive. Lots of research gone into it to keep it as historically accurate as possible. And I really recommend it. And there's loads of stuff that you might miss just because it's now visual. You can now see it. Darren and I were talking before we came live, the allusions to Daniel in and around Jesus' temptation. And that's all visualized in there as well. So we're going to talk a little bit about some of those allusions as we go. And we're just going to dig into Matthew and enjoy ourselves. Darren, was there any more of an introduction that you wanted to give? Maybe, possibly, what we've covered so far would probably be a good start.
Well, I've got to think back to what we've covered. We did. Look, it's been a while. We covered chapter 2 with death. The Matthew's language of death, and how it normally refers to death, and we got into the Sermon on the Mount, and turns out that in the Sermon on the Mount, Matthew and Jesus are drawing a lot from Psalms 37, and Psalms 37 has this: you either live in inherit the land, the meek will inherit the land, you'll live on it forever, or you'll just pass away, you'll die, you'll be destroyed. So the Sermon on the Mount has a fair bit of ways that Jesus or Matthew unpacks that thesis. It's one or the other, and it ends in with the idea that there's the narrow way that leads to life and the broad way that leads to destruction. So that's a bit of a Matthean synopsis of Psalms 37. But at the end of the Sermon on the Mount, Matthew includes a note on how the crowd listening to Jesus had come to regard him as one who had a unique authority as a teacher. So he's being set aside, or he's being shown to be a unique kind of Messiah. In chapters 8 and 9, Jesus will go on to perform a lot of miracles that show him who he is as a unique Messiah, as one of power and authority. We're only doing chapter 8 today because typically that happens with me. I dig into a text and I find what seems to be, on the surface, no, not much. I find a lot more detail that helps us. Helps the cause of conditionalism.
Good.
So it won't be everything. So what I'll do is, I think what we should do is just read through the text and just stop when we find something. And sometimes it's just something that a traditionalist might use a verse and go, hey, yeah, Matthew teaches the traditional view of hell and not conditionalism. I think we should just stop at those points. Philip, would you have anything to add by way of intro?
Not particularly. I think you've covered it just a reminder, really, of the other four parts. Repeatedly, some themes of destruction, the language of apolomai. I don't think we see that too much in chapter 8, but so far the language has been consistently one of destruction, as there is an end to the wicked. And Matthew so far has not left any room for eternal torment. So I think in terms of burden of proof with these first few chapters, the traditionalist has their work cut out for them. Um, I think we've been sort of walking down this road for quite a while, but the burden of proof on a traditionalist to show why Matthew 2, the language of apolomai, should be ignored when dealing with apolomai later on. So Matthew 2, if you're not sure of it, look at the part 1. We looked at Matthew chapter 1 and 2, and where Herod is seeking to kill Jesus. The word there, kill, is apolomai. That is used then later on in Matthew 10, and that language is really quite strong to do with death and destruction, an end rather than torment. And so just a reminder, really, that throughout the whole of the gospel, up to this point, we have not seen anything remotely close to eternal torment in any of the passages when it comes to the language of judgment. So I just wanted to put that out there, really, as just a reminder. And if you don't believe us, well, there's probably about 6 hours worth, I think it is, maybe a bit more, of content with you and me chatting through this. And we are looking to put this into writing. You're looking to write it as a book. I'm happy to at some point edit some of the things down and put them onto the helpproject.online. But there's a lot of content here that we've gone through carefully, and to say that there's no eternal torment is because we literally can't find it in there. So without any real further ado, that's my introduction. Jesus, I like how you said it. Jesus has a unique authority as a teacher. That's something to remember. There's something Matthew really wants you to know about who Jesus is, what he can do, and the connections to Psalm 37. If you haven't read Psalm 37, go and read it.
And then listen to when we discuss the Sermon on the Mount, because it might not be obvious at first if someone just reads that and go, "Oh, we've read the Psalm," and he only really literally quotes one part of the Psalm in Matthew 5:5. The meek will inherit the earth. But then as you go through the Sermon on the Mount, you can see how the same opposite fates are brought out by Matthew. So you've got on one side, you have only one set of people will live forever. And then Matthew has Jesus talking like there's a house that is destroyed by a flood. That destruction is talking about the same kind of theme that Psalms 37 does. That's not in any way the wicked or the unrighteous living forever. That's the Psalm 37 idea that they pass away, that they're killed, they're destroyed, utterly destroyed, it says at the end of Psalm 37. That's the picture you get from a destroyed house in a flood. Yeah. Good. And should I add here that I'm coming to realize that Matthew has an apocalyptic kind of worldview, and I don't mean he's an apocalypse like Daniel or John. I mean that there's this cosmic battle going on. There's this worldview that demons are real, that the spirit world's real, it's like Paul. He talks about powers, these invisible powers as well as visible ones on the earth. Now, Matthew here, you see, and you'll see this in 8, where you're seeing him being proven to be someone who has a unique authority. That's someone who's even able to defeat the demons. They're scared of him. There's these invisible powers. That's apocalyptic worldview. That's this idea of this cosmic, invisible, spiritual struggle. And it started in where Jesus is tempted by Satan, and he actually defeats Satan right there and then. Satan's trying to woo him to his side, and it didn't work. And then you get here this idea that he will encounter demons. And they have to do what he says. That's apocalyptic in its worldview. Okay. Yeah.
muted myself. There we go. I've muted myself. So we're going to transition then into reading the passage. I think it's really important.
Yeah.
We're digging into the Bible. Let's have the Bible in front of us. So that should now come on the screen.
Yeah.
I'll read it through as you're going to be doing quite a bit of the talking around this, Darren. I'm happy to read. I'll do my bit. So when he came down from the mountain, great crowds followed him, and behold, a leper came to him and knelt before him, saying, Lord, if you will, you can make me clean. Just checking, we're going down to verse 11, aren't we?
Yeah.
Jesus stretched out his hand and touched him, saying, I will be clean. And immediately his leprosy was cleansed. And Jesus said to him, see that you say nothing of this to anyone, but go, show yourself to the priest, and offer the gift that Moses commanded for a proof to them. When he entered Capernaum, I can never pronounce that one, Capernaum, a centurion came forward to him, appealing to him, Lord, my servant is lying paralyzed at home, suffering terribly. And he said to him, I will come and heal him. The centurion replied, Lord, I am not worthy to have you come under my roof, but only say the word, and my servant will be healed. For I too am a man under authority, with soldiers under me, and I say to one, go, and he goes, and to another, come, and he comes, and to my servant, do this, and he does it. When Jesus heard this, he marveled and said to those who followed him, truly I tell you, with no one in Israel I have found such faith. I tell you, many will come from east and west, recline at the table of the kingdom, table with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob in the kingdom of heaven, while the sons of the kingdom will be thrown into the outer darkness. In that place there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth. And just to finish this section, and to the centurion Jesus said, go, let it be done for you as you have believed. And the servant was healed at that very moment.
Yeah. So, do you have any thoughts to start? Because I know where I want to go with this, although it's been a while since I wrote these notes. But do you have any thoughts? Because once I get going, you might have to wave at me to get me to stop.
No, it's fine. I think where you're going is pretty much my instinct. When I read this, or when I was aware, maybe I was just aware of the verses. I think it's really interesting that going through the whole of Matthew as we are. I'm just very aware of the context, but so often you'll hear these verses just thrown at your feet and go, deal with this. Here's this outer darkness, weeping and gnashing of teeth, this place of terror. And in some ways it's language of judgment, definitely. But in the context, it's very interesting. It raises more questions when it's in this context. Why would Jesus do this now in the middle of a story of healing? Why would Matthew place this in his story of healing? There's a bunch of questions that come up when you see it in context, but when you see it out of context in a conversation about hell, and someone says, look, hey, there's this verse that says outer darkness and weeping and gnashing of teeth, therefore hell is terrible, ongoing, conscious torment. It's hard now for me to empathize, but when I saw it before, it's like, well, yeah, of course, weeping and gnashing of teeth, that implies experience, that implies an ongoing nature. But as we'll discuss, it doesn't imply an eternally ongoing nature. There's no sense of real duration here. And the reason that implication is there, and I'll kind of play the traditionalist on this part, is the aspect of weeping and gnashing in teeth is assumed to be weeping is sorrow, but gnashing of teeth is pain. And so that would be a traditionalist, or that was my traditionalist understanding before I really dug into what the Bible says about hell. So that's kind of where I want you to lead from, and I think you do in your notes. So I'm happy for you to take it from there.
Okay, so yes, so when we conditionalists say, look, there's nothing in Matthew that actually talks about eternal conscious torment. I know traditionalists are just like going, ugh, and they're looking at detail like this. They're looking at there's two aspects of this verse. Where is it? I'll tell you, many will come from east and west and recline at the table with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob in the kingdom of heaven, while the sons of kingdom will be thrown into the outer darkness. In that place will be weeping and gnashing of teeth. The outer darkness and the weeping and gnashing are two central planks within a traditionalist argument, and they usually just go, well, why doesn't that speak to eternal conscious torment? And on the one side of the coin, what they're presuming is that we have a blipping out of existence kind of view of annihilationism. So we would clarify and say, no, it's death. And why we say death isn't just because that's what Matthew says. It's talking about slaying and killing and capital punishment, but because that actually does allow us to say it's, you can have things like you can have weeping and gnashing of teeth as you're being killed. That could be on that day, it could happen as a process, but it doesn't exclude that idea. And actually it takes it in, because if you're being dragged to the place you're going to be executed, then yes, we're going to be able to say, yes, those people will be weeping, and they're defiant, they're weeping, they're infinitely sad, they're very sad, they're weeping, they're crying, and that gnashing is more of an anger, and it's as we'll go through. If you look at all of the biblical data when you've got weeping and gnashing, it never has to do with pain. You've got in Acts where you've got Stephen he's preaching to the Jews, and they're grinding their teeth in anger. That's the kind of thing that you get. So we've got plenty of room. We're saying that fits with an execution view of annihilationism. But I'm going to first focus on being thrown in the outer darkness, because what traditions will say is, I think there's a couple of reasons they might point to that. One is we focus on fire, and they go, okay, how is the imagery of fire, how does that comport with the imagery of darkness? And then they try and just put a wedge between those two images. And there's this really popular view of the traditional view, which isn't really traditional anymore, but it's the symbolic view, which says it's kind of conflicting imagery. So we want to say it's serious, but they end up saying it's just some kind of symbolic suffering or symbolic exclusion. And someone like Greg Cook or Tim Barnett at Stand to Reason might emphasize the outer darkness in order to say, to emphasize the separationism that they have in their view of eternal conscious torment. So you're separated to another realm or another place, you're cordoned off, and that's your suffering. Yeah. Is that you're God has turned his back on you and things like that. You're separated from there. They do try to explain that there's real suffering as part of that. I'm not trying to minimize that, but for a traditionalist, these two phrases will be throwing it into the outer darkness, and in that place will be weeping and gnashing of teeth, are very important phrases for the traditionalists. So we do have to spend time explaining them. As it turns out, outer darkness only appears, what have I got here in my notes? The phrase outer darkness only appears in the Bible in Matthew and only in two other places in that gospel. So we've actually got, it's not as ubiquitous as people think. And that affords us, in one way, the ability to look at what Matthew himself meant by it when he used it. It might not give us enough data in terms of the more that someone uses a phrase, the more information you get, the more precise your understanding in given context. We don't really have that, but we do have a good idea of what Matthew meant when he used it. So the other places are Matthew 22:13, where you've got a parable, and it's about a king and his attendants, and it ends up with, then the king said to the attendants, bind him hand and foot and cast him into the outer darkness. In that place there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth. So you've got outer darkness. And Matthew 25:30, we're talking about unfaithful servants, and cast the worthless servant into the outer darkness. In that place there'll be weeping and gnashing of teeth. Now just excuse me while I look at my notes. So where we go with this data is we note that they're in context of a parable, where either a feast is in view, Like, so you're using, Jesus was using imagery of a earthly feast to talk about something about the kingdom. And in that context, you get these unfaithful people are thrown outside that environment. So that's a well-lit, well-fed, it's a play environment where people are enjoying themselves, people are living well, and they're outside. Now, in that context, I say in the first century, if you're outside of the city or outside of the safe place, then especially if you're bound hand and foot, then that's like a death sentence. That's not a sentence of you're going to live there forever. There's nothing within those contexts would suggest that someone is going to live forever. But the idea of darkness really comes just from those contexts that you've got well lit environment. It's not saying something about the or I was going to say it's not a metaphysical statement. It's not talking about the place of Gehenna at all. It's not saying Gehenna is dark. What it's saying is just when you're out of the kingdom, in this parable, the way we were describing that exclusion was that you're outside that lit area. It's outside, it's dark. So when you're thrown out of there, that's all that is. It's not something that Matthew would have used, I think, to say to describe the landscape or geography of hell. Do you have anything to say on that, Philip?
Yeah. So a little bit, not too much, because I was also typing while you were talking, trying to see who's in the live chat. So it's always a way keeping up with two things at once. But
Sure.
I think it's really important just to note that the Messianic banquet is a vital image of eschatology that I only sort of came across by accident. It doesn't often come up in conversations around hell. Hell is this fiery place, and that's got nothing to do with the banquet. The banquet's in heaven, and in one way that's right. But the Messianic banquet is very much an earthly image, a new creation image, and to have Abraham, Jacob, and Isaac present is important. But it's a connector to Isaiah 25 and the great feast that when death is fully defeated. You've got an amazing verse of all nations, the best wine, and the shroud that covers all nations will be swallowed up, and that's death. Death will be defeated. So the image of the feast is good news, but yes, outside of there's nothing good, and to insinuate that outside of this feast is an ongoing existence. It's kind of like the banishment view of hell, anyway, that links back to the sort of scapegoat idea. Is the sins were cast out of the people and they were left to go. And if that's this idea of banishment, well, you have to assume that then the scapegoat was living forever if that's going to apply to judgment. Yeah. So I've really struggled with the banishment idea. Once you're separated from where life is.
I don't, because I think if you're separated from God, you're separated from the kingdom.
Sorry, let me rephrase that. I struggled with that idea from a traditionalist perspective.
Oh, okay. Yeah. Okay.
Before, yeah, right. So I don't struggle because it makes sense in a conditionalist perspective. Yeah. Because once you're separated from life, from where the feast is, from where the people are, from where protection is, well, you're only going to end up dead and cut off, and that's the language of cut off is very much a language of death. So, sorry, I think I went off track, but I just want to emphasize that the Messianic banquet is just a sort of important image that people need to continue to refer back to, and I'm not really sure if that really helps.
So just to show people that we're not just making this up, I did have a quote from David Turner. He's a traditionalist. He's got a commentary in the Baker Exegetical Commentary series on the New Testament, and this is what he says of Matthew 25:30. though there is no mention of a feast in the context of Matthew 25:30, the parable does revolve around the journey and return of the man who gave the talents. It is plausible to think that this man's return would have been accompanied by a banquet. In the parable of the talents in Matthew 25, the good and faithful servants who managed the talents well are told they would enter the master's joy. Entrance into the master's joy probably portrays entrance into the eschatological feast that inaugurates the reign of Jesus on earth. And guess where he's that's 1813. But he goes back and he points back when he talks about refers to the eschatological feast. He refers back to 8:11 where we're talking. So this idea, even when it's not explicit, this idea that it's attached to an eschatological feast or the messianic kingdom or something like that, entrance into the master's joy, it's all about this, like you said, this earthly scene of a banquet of relating to what were you saying again? I've just lost that track of thought. But
no worries.
It's
yeah, no,
you go.
Yeah, messianic banquet pointing to
That's it.
eschatology.
That's it. What it isn't it's not a statement of the metaphysics of hell. Yeah. And you've got to see it in the context. Sometimes mostly these are parables, but you've got to see it within those contexts and not overinterpret it. So there's a guy who he's Greek. I can't say his last name. Papa Inu or something. Yeah. I wish I could do justice to his name. He wrote the Geography of Hell, where he looks at this kind of phraseology. And he says the phrase "the outer darkness" is language that finds meaning only within the symbolism of the kingdom as a banquet, and only carries the notion of exclusion from the blessings that the kingdom represents. That's what it's talking about. It's more referring to what you're being denied, those blessings of the kingdom, than saying, "Hey, you're gonna suffer in the outer darkness forever." All right. It has to be understood in its own context. And so outer darkness, I think, doesn't really support a tradition. So what you'll find them saying when we do talk and we say Matthew really supports conditionalism, they'll throw this outer darkness text at you going, therefore, look, and you go, well, look at that in context. And the imagery, their parables of the Messianic feast, it's just telling you that they're not partaking in that. And even there's indication, when you're bound hand or foot, that they're gonna. That's like more like a death sentence. That's what it looks like. Even though that's not overt, and it's not like he's saying you'll kill. So it's not overt, but that's what it's implying. So it doesn't really lead that way to lend itself support to traditionalism.
Yeah, agreed with all of those. Just before we move on to the second part of the gnashing of teeth, just some interesting things I noted when looking at darkness. In Exodus 20:21, the thick darkness is where God was. In Deuteronomy 4 and 5, we see the Lord speaking from the midst of thick darkness, and so there's an idea of God being both fire and dwelling in darkness in all those references. There's a connection, and I just find that fascinating when people want to be so. There's this idea that God kind of removes himself from hell, from judgment, that people close themselves in and lock the door. That kind of idea of eternal conscious torment, that's all internalized and we are the source of our own torment, makes this idea that, well, God is good, God is light, and therefore he can't be darkness, actually ignores these passages where God is compared to being darkness and speaking from darkness, and so very literally there is nowhere that you can go where he is not. And so being cut off in this way doesn't necessarily mean that you're not experiencing God in the fullness of his presence. That's kind of where I'm processing at the moment that
Mm.
hell, the idea and concept of hell as a place isn't quite right, because we want to remove this place of hell from God's presence. But if the location, like Gehenna was a location, is more of a symbol of what will happen to the wicked, and God is a consuming fire, God is darkness, God will consume the wicked, which is also a biblical idea, then this outer darkness and hell itself is actually an aspect of God's presence that will destroy the wicked, and we can only be in God's presence as the righteous because we're clothed in Christ.
Mm.
And so all this imagery is actually can point back to who God is.
Mm.
And there's 1 Samuel 2:9 was another one that I linked to. We see the faithful will be guarded, but the wicked shall be cut off in darkness. And cut off as well just consistently implies an end. I mean, I get to have the privilege of being able to speak to a rabbi every week as part of my job, working with university students on campus. And he's very clear that cut off doesn't imply ongoing anything.
No, it means to kill. It means to be killed. You can actually go through the Old Testament and find out just numerous examples where cut off means like they're killed, they're slain. Yeah. And you get cut off from the community of Israelite, and that can have some idea of like you're excluded from that, but that leads to death. And I'm gonna do more study on that.
Yeah, the last one that I looked at when I looked at darkness was Job. Job says that utter darkness is laid up for the wicked man's treasures, and he, the wicked, will be devoured by an unfanned fire, and whatever is left over will be consumed. So darkness, fire, judgment, all aspects of what will happen to the wicked. And just an emphasis here that this imagery actually implies the opposite of what a traditionalist would usually say. So instead of it being removed from God's presence, actually it's being in God's presence that's what's happening, and it doesn't imply ongoing existence, but actually to be cut off.
There's two things I want to say now that probably could have said at the beginning. One is remember the right at the beginning of the Sermon on the Mount. So Matthew 5:5, where we've talked about this, Jesus is, is quoting Psalms 37. The meek will inherit the earth, and we've unpacked that. And Psalms 37 has this idea of you inherit the earth, the land, you live on it forever. It's very covenantal. But then it talks about those who are unrighteous as just being like grass, withering away, they're dying, they're utterly destroyed. That's an either or. That's binary. That's you're in there, you're enjoying the blessings, or you're not. You're dead. You're gone. All right. That's the kind of thing that these parables, these passages are talking about. You're in or you're out. If you're in, you have you're experiencing that blessing. You're out. That's it. There's no in between where you're out and you're living forever. That's part of, I think, Matthew's unpacking of Psalms 37 throughout his gospel. But the other point I want to make is when you look at different parts of this, even the same gospel, not everything in every passage should be just drawn, not every bit of detail should be drawn out and put together. So what traditions will do, they'll go, okay, here's a verse that says eternal fire. Here's a verse that says weeping and gnashing of teeth. Here's a verse that says out of darkness, and we'll just put all that out and we'll just put these phrases together here and create something new. Yeah, within their own context, within these passages, with exclusion from the feast, it's very limited with what it's saying. It's just saying it's away from, it's out from there. And if there is anything in the detail that indicates the experience, you're bound. You're excluded from that. As an earthly scene, that's more like a death, an execution, a death sentence. Now, the traditions will, rightly, in chapter 8, where we started, will say, but it also has the weeping and gnashing. Isn't that indicative of someone who's suffering? Well, if you look through Matthew, and there's only one other place, I think it's Luke, that you have weeping and gnashing of teeth. I could be wrong on that, but most of them in Matthew, he uses it here and there more as a summary statement of how people react when they realize they've been brought to judgment. And the most definitive one is Matthew 13:40 to 42, where the weeds are burned up in the fire. It's a superheated fire. It's all causes of sin, and all lawbreakers are brought there. And it's very explicit. Catechio, I will get into this when we get to this. There's a lot more detail that we can get into to support what I'm saying here. But right at the end, it says, in that place, there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth. Jesus is explicit that those people will be burned up. Mm-hmm. Yet there is weeping and gnashing as in that place. So as they're brought there, it's a bit more of a summary of what they realize, of their reaction as they realize what's happening to them. They're crying, they're weeping, and there's this anger at this, that there's this direct opposition. Now that comes back to what I'm talking about, the apocalyptic worldview. So you've got Jesus on the one side, and you get demons in the world, and the powers, and you got the devil, Satan, the evil one. They're in direct opposition. They're angry. They set themselves against him. So this reaction of anger is quite normal for that worldview. What I want to do now is go through just a couple of just discuss a little bit that language of weeping and the language of gnashing, and just to show that I'm not just throwing this out there because I don't like the traditionalist argument. It's actually, you look at all the biblical data, it never talks in the way that the traditionalist needs it to, as if it's weeping and gnashing is just a synonym for I'm crying in pain forever. So the word in the Bible, the word or a frequent word used is klauthmos in the Greek. So in the Septuagint, so that's the Greek translation of the Old Testament, it appears in places like Judges 21:2, 2 Samuel 13:36, Ezra 3:13, Isaiah 15:3, 22:12, 65:19, Jeremiah, it's in Joel, it's in Malachi or Malachi, however you want to say it.
Malachi, I've never heard that.
The only Italian prophet.
Malachi.
So that's from my Bible college days. But when you look them up, and I'm happy if people want us to show, prove this. But
I've shown it on the screen, the different references that you've got.
I pulled one up. So Isaiah 15. Verses 2 to 3 says, "He has gone to the temple and to Dibon, to the high places to weep over Nebo, over Medeba, Moab, Wales." Sorry, let me say it again. These Hebrew words, I read them, I don't say them. So I'll say this again. "He has gone up to the temple and to Dibon, to the high places to weep over Nebo and over Moab, Wales. On every head is baldness, every head is shorn. In the streets they wear sackcloth. On the housetops and in the squares everyone wails and melts in tears." So that idea is of grief. It's a deep sadness. That's what you find every time you look up the word, this idea of weeping in the Bible.
Yeah.
So I'll go back to Matthew 13, where we know they're being destroyed by fire. You can see that this is, if you realize you're going to be destroyed and you're weeping deeply, there's that sense of deep grief being conveyed by that. It's not in any way an idea that you're in pain, or pain might be part of it, but that's not its primary point. Does that make sense?
Yep, definitely.
Yep. So in and of itself, weeping doesn't support the traditionalist point of view. Gnashing is similar. and it's just used. It's always used of this idea of you're grinding your teeth in anger.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and here's the one that I said before, Acts, when they're talking about Stephen. So Stephen in Acts, he's preaching to the Jews, and this is what is said of them. Now, when they heard these things, they were enraged and they ground their teeth at him. You can imagine Satan or the devil who had opposed Jesus. He tried to tempt Jesus at the beginning of his ministry, and Jesus rebuffed him. How he's set in opposition. He's got this, he could be so angry at him. Now he's going to be included and thrown in that fire because it's in Matthew 13, it's all causes of sin. That includes the devil who sowed the weeds. That anger, you can picture that anger as being part of his experience as he's destroyed. Now, keep in mind, traditionalists, we're not saying that it's instant blipping. It's not an instant burning up necessarily. It's an execution.
Mm-hmm.
And there's plenty of room for us to say, as they're brought to it, they realize they weep and gnash. Um, but I would regard weeping and gnashing, as I said, as a summary statement, more pointing to that reaction rather than saying something about the metaphysics or the ontological state of people, the metaphysics of hell and the ontological state of people in hell.
Yeah. Yeah. No, I agree. And so I don't have anything really to add. I mean, I've already said that often people read gnashing of teeth as pain, and that's not a biblical view. That's been read into the text by traditionalists. I know that's argued by, I think it's is it Robert Peterson? I think he
Every
argues that it's a painful
every,
existence.
every traditionalist ever.
Yeah, I've
Yeah,
read pain into
basically
that. Yeah.
every you like, if not immediately, when you push back, they will inevitably
Mm.
cite those two things: the outer darkness and the weeping and gnashing, and they'll just mostly just cite it. And if pushed, they will try to explain a little bit, but they don't get very far. Now, the reason that they think initially that it does say something is because of the assumption that we're like J Dubs, that we just have this idea of blipping out of existence.
Yeah.
That's the only reason that they think it works. So they think that because there's blipping out of existence in our view, therefore we have no room for pain. We have no room for weeping. We have no room for anger. We have no room
Mm.
for so they have to do is show that there is anguish, and they've won the debate on that point. And we go, hang on,
Yeah.
no. If you look at this in the context of the narrative where you're being brought to God for judgment, you're being brought to that place, and you see this superheated fire, and you know what it's going to do. That there's every um, there's there's plenty of room for us to say, yep,
Mm-hmm.
there can be anguish as that happens. Even if you took 5 minutes for me to burn up in a superheated fire, I am going to weep. I'm going to cry, even if it was pain. Yeah.
Yep.
So
Absolutely.
it's only because of their understanding of our view that they think that just citing that detail helps them.
Mm.
So I think our task is
Yeah.
trying to help them to move beyond that. But I don't find much success. People don't like giving up arguments they think gives them the upper hand, which is
Mm.
why sometimes they try to pull us back and say, no, you really are about non-existence. So, well, no, I'm really about the penalty being a death
Death. Yeah.
sentence. So, yeah.
Yeah. Um, Maybe if we have time at the end, I've been involved in a bit of a thing on Twitter. I might just do a little bit of a bit at the end of this about death and its definition if we have time. But I think it's really
Remember, we started our series with that, but I wouldn't mind
yeah,
ending
that's
today with.
that's true. Yeah, just to go back to that. So we have discussed death in detail throughout this channel. I've got several video, or at least one that says what is death. Continuously, we define death as the cessation of life, and but all the time, and it happened today. A post back to me was very much here's the definition of what a conditionalist says, but they mean out of existence, cessation of existence, and that's not quite true, and it's not quite what the biblical view is either when it comes to that. And but saying that, when looking at things like Psalm 37, we can use language like "they will be no more." The hope of a new creation with no more wicked. They will be
Yeah,
no more. They will. So, but the process of becoming no more may
yeah,
well be having this image of weeping, gnashing. I mean, there's going to be shame. There's going to be anger. That makes sense of that worldview. So I just wanted to just point back to Psalm 37 again, because Matthew is aware of Psalm 37. There is a day coming when
yeah,
they will be cut off and they will be no
yeah,
more. And
yeah.
so even if I'm misquoted as death being cessation of existence, I am on biblical ground to make that claim.
Well,
Um,
yeah. So I always try to emphasize, and we people who are listening now haven't listened to our previous discussions need to realize that we talk assuming that knowledge that we from our previous discussions, but I don't mind going back over it again. When we talked about Matthew 2, and the way he refers to the death of say Jesus, the possible death of Jesus as an infant at the hands of Herod, and all the children that died. He used different ways of talking about death. Now, one way was those children. He says those children were slain by the soldiers that Herod ordered to kill them. He says they're no more because they're not there anymore because they're dead.
yeah.
The logical link between having your life ended and eventually in one way or the other being not around and not being no more is sound. Like it's the idea that you if if my body is killed, it doesn't blip out of existence. It lies there on the ground, unless of course
Mm-hmm.
it was a nuclear explosion. So the mode of death changes it.
Yeah.
But the idea is that my molecules are still there. You can still see my body there. It hasn't blipped out of existence, but it's had its lifestyle and its vital functions have ceased to operate. So it's inert, inactive, and inanimate, but it's
Mm-hmm.
still there. It's
So
not
yeah.
ceased to exist.
Yeah.
Um, and Matthew will go on in 10:28 to say that that happens to the body and the soul.
Yeah.
So that's what we're talking about when we say death. But we don't deny that logically is followed by the idea that they're not there anymore. The person isn't there anymore. But we're not saying that. What we're saying is that non-existence is not part of our definition of death. And that's the
Yeah.
bit that traditionalists have to wrap their head around if they want to adequately rebut what we're saying. Not insist that death to us is defined as non-existence, which is their normal way of doing it. And so that's where you're getting into with that discussion. I'd love
Yeah.
to do a separate video on and unpacking that too, just
Yeah.
because I like
Yeah. Definitely.
getting into it.
Yeah.
Can I
And I
can
think
I
that is necessary. Yeah. Let's carry on. Yeah.
can I segue back into
Mm.
another verse, Matthew 24:51, where you have this another, like I've already talked about Matthew 13, where very explicitly they're killed by the fire. But there's another one that was a bit of a line ball for me, where you had gnashing and teeth mentioned alongside these people being cut in pieces and put with the hypocrites.
Mm. Yep.
If you look that up, what was that story again? Just to put it in context for
Yeah.
people.
It's
So Matthew
probably good.
24. Do you want to just pull that up and
Yeah.
give
Let
a
me do that.
summary? Don't read it out. We just give a summary of the main thrust.
Matthew 24. There you go. This is when my laptop fails to keep up.
Okay. Do you want me to
Here
do
we
it?
go.
Right.
So is Matthew 24 and the verse? Was it 51?
41.
41.
20,
Just.
yeah, 24. Hang on. Now I've lost my notes. So 24:51.
That's right.
So there'll be that parable that's preceding that is part of.
Yeah, so it's all about the Son of Man. On it, so yeah, you got the. Yeah, what were we 50, 51? Yeah, so the faithful servant. If I just quickly swip over so people can see where I'm reading. So who then is the faithful servant, faithful and wise servant, whom his master has set over his household to give them their food at the proper time. Blessed is that servant whom his master will find so doing when he comes. Truly I say to you, he will set him over all his possessions. But if that wicked servant says to himself, my master is delayed, and begins to beat his fellow servants and eats and drinks with drunkards, so the master of that servant will come on a day when he does not expect him, and at an hour he does not know, and will cut him in pieces and put him with the hypocrites. In that place there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth.
Yeah. So again, just to emphasize, I'm looking at weeping and gnashing as a summary statement, but we'll cut him into pieces. It literally means to cut in two. So it sounds like a death sentence, and there's nothing.
Pretty severe.
Yeah, it's just because you see there's weeping and gnashing of teeth, you might think, oh, that might actually be about flogging, cut you to pieces. Yeah. Which is legit, because I've held off on that for a long time, asserting that might be a death sentence. They're killing them. But, where are we? Someone like Leon Morris, discusses this. I'm just looking. Yeah, he says this cannot be meant literally, as in the man is still alive in the next clause, but clearly it stands for a severe punishment, perhaps a heavy beating. So he's looking at that. He's looking at how there's these two statements. You're literally cut in two, and you're literally weeping and gnashing. It must be a flogging. That's that, and I think that's fair enough. I think that's fair enough.
Yeah.
But let me just look at my notes. Right. So. If I go back and I just remind the listeners, I keep saying that people, I'm tempted to keep saying readers, but we're on a live stream. You're not readers.
Yeah, that's it. Yeah.
You're listeners. This is regarded more as a summary statement of judgment context, or to say, yeah, where Matthew's just using as a summary statement rather than a description of literally what is happening. And you can tell that by the different ways he uses it in different contexts. Excuse me. R.T. France, who was an annihilationist, wrote this: the term used for the slave's punishment, cut in two, occurs elsewhere in biblical literature only for the dismemberment of sacrificial animals. This practice is, however, taken as a model for human punishment in Jeremiah 34:18. There is no evidence for its use anywhere else as merely a metaphor for severe punishment. And it is probably to be taken here literally as a particularly brutal execution. And then he quotes other Old Testament verses, which goes far beyond the parameters of the story and is meant, like the tortures of 1834, to shock the reader into response. So he's saying it's a little bit hyperbolic, saying it's being killed. So if it was to be a metaphorical use of the word cut in two to say flog, it's unique. It hasn't happened anywhere. Now, that's not impossible, but the only reason you would say it is because that next clause, the weeping and gnashing of teeth. But if you keep in mind, that's just a summary statement. You take that out of the picture. No, it's more of an idea of them being executed. But it's in that context, it's to shock the reader of Matthew. So you kind of lose a bit of that when it's not being killed. It's just you're being flogged. So that's kind of I'm not asserting this as a definite reading, but I wanted to help our listeners to maybe work through how they might sort that out. You certainly do have Matthew 13. That is definitely, it's unambiguously about them being killed by that fire.
Yeah.
All right.
Yeah, I think that's good. I think that nails down that passage. It does make it more ambiguous, and I think that's where I'm quite happy leaving it.
Yeah.
Is the traditionalist generally is dead certain this is what it means, and
Yeah.
I don't think it's as clear cut, literally in Matthew 24 as that. So yeah, shall we leave it at that for weeping and gnashing of teeth? And I'm sure we'll come back on that in a few sessions' time.
I'll come back to 8, 11, and 12. Read it again, just to tie it up before we move on. All right. So because we've been talking about different elements,
Yeah.
what I've been pulling for everywhere, and I just want to pull it
Yeah.
together. So in 8:11, he says, "I tell you that many will come from the east and west to recline at the table with Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and the kingdom of heaven." That's that messianic feast. That's the allusion to that. You're going to be excluded from that. Okay. While the sons of the kingdom will be thrown in the outer darkness, and in that place will be weeping and gnashing of teeth. So neither outer darkness, when you look into Matthew, really indicates anything other than you're just excluded from that life. It's a bit more like you're not inheriting the land and you're going to die. That's the kind of theme that Matthew has going here. And in that place, there'll be weeping and gnashing of teeth is more of a summary statement of that will be used in judgment context where we know that execution is in place. It's not saying that in that outer darkness they will weep and gnash forever by any means.
Yeah.
That is not what you can get from Matthew. All right. And if a traditionalist disagrees, they've got to go through. And actually, if you want to track me down on Rethinking Hell on Facebook and pull up any of these verses I've highlighted, because I really rushed some of them, probably didn't give enough context because of time, please do get on. We'll let you in. You talk to it. Have a go at me. Say, no, you're misreading it as an exegete. We'll go through. We'll talk about it. And the nitty gritty, we can get into it.
Yep.
So I do want to give people the opportunity to push back on that. Okay. Cool. So where do we go next?
Shall I? So, and I'm just looking at time. So we're at the 1 hour mark on the actual stream. Though it took us about an hour to get started. So if we go through the next bit, I think there's some important stuff to say regarding the next passage. Maybe if we just summarize a little bit that bit before moving on. So
Sure.
I'll read to.
There was, if you read from 14 to 22, right at the verse 22, there's another verse that traditions might use that I wanted to address. Are you happy to do that?
Yeah, happy to do that. I think it covers some important topics. So here we go. And when Jesus entered Peter's house, he saw his mother-in-law lying sick with a fever. He touched her hand, and the fever left her, and she rose and began to serve him. That evening they brought to him many who were oppressed by demons, and he cast out the spirits with a word and healed all who were sick. This was to fulfill what was spoken by the prophet Isaiah. He took our illnesses and bore our diseases. Now when Jesus saw a crowd around him, he gave orders to go over to the other side. Is he by a lake? I'm pretty sure there's a lake in that. I just noticed that he doesn't actually give.
You got to go back to the beginning of the.
Yeah. Back in chapter 8. I'm sure we're by a lake.
Yeah, it does change context.
Yeah. And the scribe came up and said to him, "Teacher, I will follow you wherever you go." And Jesus said to him, "Foxes have holes and birds of the air have nests, but the Son of Man has nowhere to lay his head." Another of the disciples said to him, "Lord, let me first go and bury my father." And Jesus said to him, "Follow me and leave the dead to bury their own dead."
Yeah, you see where I'm going here. Just before I get going on this, notice how you've got verse 16, and the evening they brought him many who were oppressed by demons, and he cast out the spirits. That's the apocalyptic worldview. That's just humming in the background that will play an important role in what Matthew says later. 13, verse 13, chapter 13 and 25 I have in mind. So I just want to flag that's the direction I'm going.
Yeah. But just when you use that phrase apocalyptic, I think you did clarify it earlier. I just want to re-emphasize apocalypse doesn't necessarily mean end times.
No,
and it doesn't necessarily mean
an apocalypse it refers to the genre. It's a particular idea. Like you look at Daniel, you look at Revelation, right? That's a genre. It's an apocalypse. Now, both those are mixed with other genres, but that's pretty much what you got. And you had it in Second Temporal literature, a whole lot of apocalypse.
And apocalypse itself actually means revelation.
So when you might say, that book is apocalyptic, you might be referring to as genre. I'm not referring to the genre. In Matthew, you have apocalyptic sections that you might call it the little apocalypse, the Olivet Discourse. But I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about the apocalyptic. So apocalyptic is an adjective. What are you what's the concept that you are modifying when you use that adjective? It's the perspective. It's the worldview.
Yeah,
Apocalyptic worldview.
something's being revealed
Yep.
through
So,
this.
what's that author that wrote those books about those angels and demons and Frank
Oh,
Peretti,
oh,
right? That's
oh yeah, yeah,
apocalyptic
yeah,
in
yeah,
its
yeah,
perspective, right?
yeah,
He doesn't necessarily say that that's what is going to happen, but he's giving that apocalyptic worldview of this cosmic battle between in the air in the world. They're interacting with us on the earth, but they're invisible and then they're visible. That's the good powers
mm,
versus the evil powers, and which one's going to win? Yeah,
yeah, yeah, yeah,
that's the
definitely.
apocalyptic worldview. That's you wouldn't say he's an apocalypse. His books is
No,
apocalyptic in the sense that the genre is. So keep that in mind. That's what I'm saying about Matthew.
sounds good.
All right. So his miracles, when he's performing miracles, he's performing exorcisms. They're victories over those powers.
Mm,
Yeah. Yeah.
yeah,
So, and
yeah,
where that's going to end is their ultimate defeat. And what does that look like? Yeah. So that's where it's heading.
yeah. That's cool. That's good.
But this particular little verse statement from Jesus in 22, and Jesus said to him, "Follow me and leave the dead to bury their own dead," has been used in the past by traditionalists to say, hey, look, Matthew has a spiritual dead perspective of death. You're spiritually dead. Have you heard that before?
Yeah, all the time, all the
Yeah.
time. Yeah, it's.
So where?
I didn't
Sorry.
quite realize how much theology is built on the concept of spiritual versus physical death, but yeah, I hear it
So
a lot.
they will just throw that at you without defining what they mean. So it's a bit like when someone says, "Oh, you're just postmodern." Everybody has a different idea what postmodern
Mm,
is. You know, is it the art? Is it the philosophy? The philosophers different have different ideas. You could just be talking generally about my Gen
mhm,
X.
mhm.
We have a particular postmodern view that's quite different to other philosophical views or what you see in art. It's unless you define what is meant by those terms, really, it just doesn't mean much. It doesn't communicate much. So you get that from
Not at all.
traditions. They go, oh, it's a spiritual death. So you're wrong. You're not accounting for a spiritual death. And you go, well, what do you mean? Separation or you're caught in sin? My general response is just to say, well, that kind of spiritual death you described just leads to the real kind of death. And I'll point
Yeah,
that out here
yeah,
is
yeah,
that you've actually got, follow me, leave the dead, the spiritually dead, if you want to call it that, to bury the real dead. Those spiritually dead end up really dead. So I don't know whether we can make much of this, but traditions do. Um,
yeah.
so what I had done is pulled up some different suggestions by scholars
Mm,
who try to work this out. Now, they don't really, and I'll say this is one of the cases where scholarship doesn't really know what Jesus is talking about. Yeah.
yeah,
So they'll talk as if they do, but they put suggestions out there as if they really do know.
yeah.
So when they say, and leave the dead to bury, so leave the dead, what does he mean by that? Um, a lot of traditions will just opt for that spiritually dead. It's a kind of a metaphor.
Mm,
Some will refer to uh, the, and I like this suggestion, but I'm not going to posit it as one we must take. But there's this idea that in Jewish ritual you had a second burial.
yeah,
Um, so they die, they're buried, and then the bone. They need to make room in the tomb, so they pack up all the bones and they put them in a casket, and they'll put them in another area, so it leaves room for the freshly deceased person to be buried there in the tomb. And that actually fits really well with the Jewish mindset of death. And what Jesus would be saying then is, look, let those really dead people who are already dead, or take care of the dead. Yeah,
hmm.
it's still kind of a metaphorical way of looking at it. Um, I'm just going to look at my notes. So that's a Jewish
That's right.
custom.
So I've put through on the screen your quotes from
Yep.
Gundry, Black, Manson, Blomberg, Turner. There is Morris on there as well. I think it's just really important to notice there's quite a lot of ambiguity and uncertainty, and that's okay.
Yeah. Well, you have to, okay, let's step back a little bit. When you do exegesis, you have to recognize when we don't know something. Like
Hmm.
in 1 Corinthians, Paul talks about women being having head covers because of the angels. We got no idea what he meant by because of the
Hmm.
angels. Yeah. I think this is a little bit like that. We don't really know. And the reason I can know we don't know is because so many scholars opt for so many different
Yeah.
options, and a lot of them just summarize and go, "Look, I think it's this." Yeah,
Yeah.
and that's okay. That's all
Hmm.
right. That's all right to do that in exegesis. If we don't know, we don't know. But if that's the case, and they really don't know, then emphasizing or asserting that it's a spiritual death, that Jesus somehow here is talking to a category of death
Hmm.
that is a different kind of death that stands contra to what we're saying death is in Matthew, then I'm not sure we can do that if scholars don't really know what's
Yeah.
going on.
Yeah. Yeah. And
Um, yeah,
well, that's one thing I've noticed. Evangelicals don't do very well with ambiguity. We like to maybe it's Westerners. Maybe I am generalizing here, but there
yeah,
is an aspect of the dealing with apologetics, seeing the frustrations many atheists have that have come from fundamentalist churches. They want certainty. They want things to be exact. They want these are the answers. And if you don't have them, then obviously something's corrupted.
yeah,
And how dare God have something that's ambiguous? And I would just find it interesting. I actually love ambiguity. I love the fact that you can dig into Scripture and find something new
yeah,
about God and learn about Him, and He sort of changes your thinking rather than me being able to understand everything here. Go
yeah,
look, I am God.
yeah.
So I just want to put it out there. I love this ambiguity. I love that it's in there, and I'm quite happy to wrestle with that. That's great. I think
There's
others
a
others
couple
should.
of drivers for us overstating the certainty. Like in an essay, when I was writing essays to be marked, you can't just say we're not sure. You have
Mm.
to finesse that. You have to say here are the options. It's likely this one because, but you have to phrase that, and it is
Yeah.
going to be more likely. When we do know something, we do really think something's good evidence. You have to say you can't be. You have to assert it as such, and that's what you get used to in academia. Because if you're wishy-washy, we're not sure. You're not
Mm.
really using your critical skills, and that's what they want to assess. Okay,
Right.
so if you are going to say one way or the other, you've got to give good reasons for it.
Yeah.
But it's also you have to start out by recognizing that there's different ways we might take this. It is could be
Yeah.
ambiguous because of it. But there's
Oh
also
yeah.
the the,
There's
the
also
doctrine.
clarity.
There's the doctrine of inspiration, which drives a lot of evangelicals to think that everything was perfectly clear because
Mm.
God said it. If God said it, it must be. And the more fundamental you get in your mindset with that, like, and I fully into. I don't um, adapt the doctrine of inspiration in any way. I think God
Mm.
fully as involved as an author of the whole Bible. I just think
Absolutely.
he part of that he chose men and the way
Mm.
men speak, and so there's that double. You've got to keep both in mind.
Yeah.
So as an exegete, I'm always looking for the personality of the human author, and God is using that personality to get what He wanted. Now, it probably made a lot of sense to the original audience, but we have these severe distances between
Mm.
us, cultural, time. There's a often we know we don't live in the Middle East, so we don't understand a lot.
Yeah.
But the doctrine of inspiration, and that does filter out to the doctrine, the corollary of the doctrine of the inerrancy of the Bible. It pulls a lot of the more conservative minded away from the ability to accept, hey, we genuinely don't know what he
Mm.
said in this. It really is immaterial in most cases because where it's ambiguous, it doesn't matter for major
Yeah.
doctrine.
Yeah.
But it does
It's when
force
you
us.
pin a major doctrine on
Yeah,
the ambiguity that you got
yeah,
a problem.
Yeah, well, that's why you have the corollary doctrines like, what is it? The more clear texts should
Yeah,
help you. Should be
translate.
used to explicate, explain, or interpret the less clear ones. So that's just a broader reason that's driving that. The other one is if you're in a debate, you just don't want to give ground, so you get stubborn, and so
Yeah,
you just go, "That's my thing," and you just don't admit. Yeah, that's part of the
yeah,
debate. People don't want to give ground in a debate because they lose face. Or they lose the debate, then they got more hard work. So that just drives people. It drives traditionalists as much as conditionalists. So if a conditionalist says it means this, and then someone goes, well, what about this? And they'll just dig their heels in just as much. So sometimes I think I'm one of them, so I know it happens. Um,
it does happen. Yeah, it's easy to.
uh, but we do have to admit that when there is ambiguity within something like this, and got Manson, he'll say something like it means that the dead bury the dead means something like that business can take care of itself. Um, Craig Blomberg, he says, perhaps even the physically dead. If Jesus is employing biting sarcasm here, worry about the affairs of this life and ceremonies for the physical dead. So he's treating it as, it's a sarcastic statement, not making a statement about some other category of death. So these are traditionalists. Leon Morris, the expression may mean those who are soon to die, as in 924. Jesus says that Jairus' daughter lives, and then when she's about to leave the realm of the dead, the meaning then is that those who are preoccupied with issues of death are the ones to concern themselves with burials. So there's different ways of looking at it. Most of those do end up coming back to some kind of positing some kind of spiritual death. My preferred approach is that outlined by John Nolan. What he says is, what can Jesus mean by saying, let the dead bury their own dead? What this imagery of the dead of burying, sorry, I'm just stumbling on his word. What is this imagery of the dead burying the dead? If dead were to refer to spiritual death, then the language would mark a sharp boundary between the community of faith and everybody else. But Jesus is responding to a matter related to physical death. See? So at least the second reference to the dead must refer to physical death. To introduce the idea of a category of spiritually dead people is to add a new thought that has no clear links with the context. Okay? So first priority must go to a physical meaning for both uses of the dead. Can the text make good sense with both uses of the dead referred to the physically dead? And then he'll go through what he'll talk about is that what I said first, that Semitic view of the dead burying the dead. When they the freshly dead,
Secondary.
they after a year they reburied,
Yeah, yeah.
and how the Jews viewed that. So that's my preferred one
Hmm.
because he makes notes about the context.
Yeah.
Our traditionalist friend R.T. France, he's an annihilationist and wrote a commentary on Matthew, actually goes the other way. He supposes it is physical, spiritual death, but he also admits there's nothing in the context that suggests as such. So for me, I'm just going to go and say, look, there's nothing in the context in Matthew or that would suggest there's some we were meant to regard this as a spiritual death. Even if it was, um, it still clearly has in mind that these people who are alive who are spiritually dead end up dead anyway. So you can't get away from it either way, no matter how you
Hmm.
cut that pie up, it still leads to our idea of death. And those dead people are dead in the sense. So we're talking
Hmm.
about the ones who are being buried. Let the dead bury the dead. Those dead, they're dead. They lost their life. Their vital functions have ceased, so that
Hmm.
their bodies are inanimate, inert, and inactive. All
Yeah.
right.
Yeah.
That's where these spiritually dead people will end up. So you can't go anywhere with it when you
Yeah.
look at it in context. That's really what I wanted to try and explain.
Yeah. And I think there's a lot of weight put on spiritual death when it there is a leap in logic from verses like this and verses like Ephesians 2, where it's basically the walking dead. um, the dead in Christ, and then linking that to the second death in Revelation, and this idea of Genesis 2 that they ate the fruit and they didn't suddenly die. There's this sort of, as you've said, they've got all these different images and sort of pasted them together to make this almost not quite doctrine of spiritual death.
Right.
And therefore, when you go to the second death, that is actually an ongoing spiritual death, because it's all wrapped up from, and there's kind of, I can see where they get it, but it's quite a leap when you've got verses like just after Genesis 2:17, you've got Genesis 3:19, where death is the return to dust.
Right.
And so it's in the context, there's this, sure, I'm quite happy with the concept of spiritual death, but it's always pointing to an end point where you reach death, where there is actual death. And so if spiritual death is a concept, well, it's the point at which you will end up in the second death, which will kill you, both body and soul.
Right. Yeah. So what you've got onto there is the biblical theological perspective, where you try and you look at different texts and you go, okay, this is what the Bible teaches overall, and here's this idea of spiritual death, right? Mm-hmm. So where I've been talking here was exegesis. So here's one that might support that thesis on what the Bible teaches on spiritual death. This verse wouldn't really be clear support for that, because in and of itself, when you interpret in context, it doesn't clearly lend itself that way anyway. Yeah. And even if it did, it's still so vividly attached to the idea of real death that you can't just create a category of spiritual death from that.
Oh yeah.
That replaces it. It just doesn't. It goes hand in hand. And that's what I've noted with, say, Genesis, what you were noting there with Genesis. Well, that separated from the garden, just led to real death anyway. And
it did, yeah.
But what they do in the biblical theology spectrum, where they err, isn't, because they're doing the bad exegesis of the primary texts, is they're not defining it. So they'll note, and this is what I've read and what I've witnessed when I've discussed this with traditionalists. They'll go, look at Genesis, it's separation. Look at Ephesians 2:1. Look, it's separation as well. When you go to Ephesians 2:1, it's not about separation. It's about how you're not responsive to God. Now, that may go hand in hand, but they've got to explain that more. And that's what I meant at the beginning, where they don't define really what they mean by spiritual death. They just use this word, just like we might say, oh, you existentialists, or the postmodernists just think that, well, each postmodernist, each existentialist is different. So you have to define what you're referring to. In each case, when you talk about how the Bible talks about spiritual death, you really got to define what's going on in the text, and you got to define what kind of spiritual death you have in mind. Because I'm quite capable of saying to them, if it's about separation in Genesis and even Ephesians 2:1, that leads to real death. So it doesn't get you anywhere anyway. So I don't particularly care whether it is or isn't because of that, and insofar as the larger debate is concerned. So yeah, that's part and parcel of doing biblical theology. You've got to be really clear on how that theme is developed and what is being said, so you get that clear picture of what spiritual death is. So if we were to say, throughout the Bible, God talks about people being excluded from his presence, excluded from the tree of life. The Israelites were excluded from the land. Okay, I'll point out where that led to their death.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and so forth.
Yeah, absolutely.
We can move on.
Yeah, so I think, yeah, again, I think we've covered spiritual death on one of our other videos. At least I feel like we have. But I think
we probably have. I really only wanted to address that more as an aside, because I know traditions will pull that up.
Yeah.
Yeah,
absolutely. And every time it becomes a little bit of hit the mouse. I don't know, that circus game, whack-a-mole. That's the one. You got to here's a verse, and you got to sort of hit the different arguments coming back at you. So yeah, I think that one's done. And just aware of time. And my room is sweltering, so I'm actually got a little bit. Keep things moving.
Let's just quickly do the next one, and then I'll go on to That the last one, which
Yeah.
was probably a little bit more time. So I know I've got winter here. It snowed in Melbourne the other day, so sorry, doesn't
Yeah,
do
no
that.
worries. It's all
And you're
good.
hot over there at 32 degrees. So
I know. I've become a little bit of a wimp, and having grown up in the equatorial climate
oh
of
goodness.
Papua New Guinea, now
Oh
I'm
man, that's even hotter than what I'm
yeah,
used to.
I know. But now I'm truly British, and it's
Uh,
33 degrees, and
all right.
that's how we go.
All right,
Plus,
quickly.
yeah. Sorry,
23 to
we go.
25. I know you want to push on because you're hot. So
It's all right. It's all good.
Jesus talks of Matthew's got Jesus getting in the boat. He follows his disciples follow him. They are in a great storm on the sea, so the boat was being swamped by the waves, and Jesus was asleep, and they say to him, they wake him up saying, Jesus, save us, Lord, we are perishing.
Mm,
Apollome's there. Does anyone have any objection to the idea that perishing means they're going to die?
yeah.
That's all I wanted to say.
Yeah. Yeah.
That's an
That's it.
example.
Yeah, and and as you point out in the notes, it's one of those go tos of look, we know this is what they mean. They mean they're going to be perished, they're going to die, and then how come that doesn't work when you're reading John 3:16?
Yeah. Why
what
doesn't that work? Like
what
it's we are perishing. That's in the active as opposed to the middle, I think. But oh no, that might be in the middle. If I look it up, the middle voice is where with Apollomi, it means to die. Like you even have that in a grammar in some of the grammars. They actually say that the middle voice. It's not even it's when it's not passive. So the middle voice in Greek is like where you're doing it to yourself. It's reflexive normally. So I might do something to myself. I might love myself in the middle voice. Yeah. So as opposed to the passive where I am loved and the active voice where you're like I'm loving someone. But when you come to Apollomi, it's not that reflexive sense. It's more the passive sense. It's happening to you, so you're perishing. And I would love to, yeah. Again, it's just provide this as an example for conditions when we say John 3:16, those that don't have eternal life they perish, and and then I go, well, no, it means some active thing. Well, just come back to Matthew and as an example. That's all it is. There's nothing more I want to make of it. This next one I do,
yeah.
26
So I'll read this.
to
Yeah,
34. Yeah, can you just
26,
read that
34.
out?
Yeah, happy to. I'll just transition so people can see where we are. Oops, double click. There we go. And he said to them, "Why are you afraid, O you of little faith?" And then he rose and rebuked the winds and the sea, and there was a great calm. And the men marveled, saying, "What sort of man is this, that even winds and sea obey him?" And when he came to the other side, to the country of the Gadarenes, 2 demon-possessed men met him, coming out of the tombs, so fierce that no one could pass that way. And behold, they cried out, "What have you to do with us, O Son of God? Have you come here to torment us before the time?" Now a herd of many pigs was feeding at some distance from them, and the demons begged him, saying, "If you cast us out, send us away into the herd of pigs." And he said to them, "Go." So they came out and went into the pigs, and behold, the whole herd rushed down the steep bank into the sea and drowned in the waters. The herdsmen fled, and going into the city they told everything, especially what had happened to the demon-possessed men. And behold, all the city came out to meet Jesus, and when they saw him, they begged him to leave their region.
Yeah. Okay. Again, it's another verse that a traditionalist might cite, and we've had debates on this recently at Rethinking Hell. Have you come here? They think, have you come here to torment before the time implies that they think they know their final fate is one of eternal torment. Yeah?
Yeah.
And you can understand why they would say that. As far as I know, the articles that we have at Free Thinking Hell kind of puts it as it could go either way, but it fits with annihilationism, so it's not necessarily good evidence for traditionalism. But I'm actually going in a different direction. I'm going to say that it actually in Matthew is more evidence for conditionalism. And a lot of that comes back to the apocalyptic worldview that you got going on here, which I'm not going to evoke here. I'm just going to talk generally about the evidence for and against. But keep that in mind, that in that apocalyptic perspective overall in Matthew, it ends in the defeat of these kinds of entities. Yeah?
That makes sense.
All right. Is that clear?
Yep.
I'll go on. First thing to note, right? When you exegete, it doesn't actually say, the demon doesn't actually say, excuse me, I've got an itchy nose. Melbourne is the hay fever capital of Australia. So, yeah, it's awful.
You got hay fever. I'm just hot. Yeah. There we go. We'll get there. We'll get through this, Darren.
There's nothing in the verse there that actually, I know it's an argument from silence, all right, but he's not actually saying we are going to be tormented forever. It doesn't say that. The next thing to note, I don't think what I just said there should be controversial. If I was a traditionalist, I would note that too. It doesn't actually say it. Therefore, I've got to do more than just cite that verse. I've got to explain how it links to it, even if it's a basic explanation to say that the demon anticipates his final punishment and even though he's not saying he's anticipating, you've got to make an argument. You can't just float that out there. And so what traditionalists will assume is that the demons have omniscience, that they know these things, right? Mm-hmm. So my next point is like, well, they don't.
Yeah.
Clearly the demon doesn't, in my mind. When I read that story, I don't get that impression that he knows what's happening, what's going to happen to him. No. There's actually similar stories within the synoptics where you get demons confronted by Jesus. Mark 1:24 and Luke 4:34, you have an unclean spirit coming to Jesus in a different context, and that demon asks him, "Are you coming to destroy me, to end me?" So he looks uncertain there. Are you coming? Are you yeah. Then in the parallels in Mark 5, 7-10, and Luke 8. 21 to 31, where you get the parallel to this story in Matthew, they actually just state it. Do not taunt me. Do not torment me. Do not do this. Matthew has them adding, do not throw us into the abyss. So when you compare sorry?
That's another word to look at, is abyss.
And I was going to, I thought we're not going to have the time because I don't think it's really material to the point that I want to make.
No, that's fine.
Except to say that when you look at these different ways that Jesus is confronting these demons in these different contexts, you do get this sense that they're fishing for, they're not really sure what's going on. Don't taunt me, please, may be a statement. But then, you've got this, Luke, don't taunt me. Don't throw me in the abyss. What are you going to do to me? Don't do this. Please don't do that. Yeah? In Matthew, that comes in the form of a question. Are you coming to me to do this to me now? He doesn't know.
Yeah.
He doesn't know. What the demon doesn't know. And I, in the study of synoptic gospels, it's really fruitful to compare and contrast similar or passages as they are unpacked in different gospels. You don't do it with John necessarily unless it's relevant. But traditionally in the gospel studies in colleges and that, they would focus on where the seams are and try and break it down and get into the history behind the history, where the story really was. I don't do that. What I look at is what has a given author like Matthew done with that material. There's clearly differences between how Mark and Luke handles the story. They have just one person possessed by the demon. Matthew has two people. He's doing something different. Luke has the abyss. Matthew doesn't have that at all. Neither does Mark. So Matthew's doing something different, but I think he's emphasizing by putting it in the question form, he's really upping that idea, or presenting that character as being more uncertain than they are in the other parallels.
Mm.
Um, and that, surprisingly, I find support for that from John Piper. Yeah,
That's interesting. Yeah,
yeah,
who's a very very traditionalist.
yeah. But he hedges his bets. So I'll read out what he says. So this is in an article specifically on this verse. It's on the Desiring God website, his website. It's an article called "Before the Time: A Fifth Column of Faith Behind the Enemy Lines." This is what he says: "What time? The time appointed for the torment of evil powers, the time of Matthew 25:41. Depart from me, accursed ones, into the eternal fire, which has been prepared for the devil and his angels." These demons in Matthew 8:29 are admitting that a time is set for their torment. They know they are doomed. They do not fight in hope of victory. They fight to drag as many of us down with them as they can. Demons know that Christ will be the one to cast them into the torment in the end. They recognize him and cry out, it's not the time yet. You're early. Demons not only know they are doomed, they know they will most certainly defeat them. Jesus Christ, they fear him. Demons learned a mystery in Matthew 8:29. They knew they were doomed. They knew the Son of God would be the victor, but they didn't know until it happened that Christ was coming before the time of final defeat. Christ is not going to wait until the atom bomb drops to end the war. He has begun to lead a subversive force in the territory of Satan. He's trained a life squad to perform the daring rescue operations. Christ has plotted many tactical victories, and before the time of the final strategic victory. Now, you'll note that even though I quoted that, or Piper's one who supports what I was saying, he goes on to say, well, no, the demons knew. But what they didn't know was the timing. They knew they were going to be tormented, but they didn't know something. Well, if you look back into his verse that he cites for how he knows they know, it's Matthew 25:41. Where does that talk about eternal torment?
It's assumed,
So
isn't it, by eternal fire and
so he's just doing the same thing anyway. So
yeah.
I could just equally point to Matthew 13, where all causes of evil are thrown in the fire and destroyed, which is more explicit. All right.
Yeah.
So again, in the narrative, how does Piper know? Like when you look at the narrative, Jesus in the narrative itself, we're looking back and we're going, we're the implied reader, we're the real readers, and we can see the story. We read it. We know where it's ending. In the narrative, that hasn't been revealed yet. That character would not know that. But Piper is acting as if they did know that, and he's using a text that doesn't say eternal torment to prove that they knew that when they said that, they were talking about eternal torment. No, it doesn't. But he does admit that they weren't omniscient. They didn't automatically know that Jesus was going to confront them in the here and now for them. Yeah. So he admits that. Yeah. So just put aside the moment that I think silly argument that eternal fire, the Matthew 25:41 somehow tells them that they're going to be tormented forever. It doesn't. He admits that they didn't know. They're not omniscient. They don't know. Yeah. Any thoughts on that?
No, I think you've nailed it on that one. I find that it's an argument I've not really thought through. I've not really come across sort of omniscience of demons and things. I've never been one to have been taught that they were omniscient. So
no, exactly.
Yeah, and it is fascinating some of the hoops people jump through to try and keep to their to what they deem is the doctrine. So, yeah, it's not something I thought through, but it makes sense that they wouldn't know. And also, it is also fascinating, especially around Matthew 25, which I'm looking forward to getting to eventually in our conversation.
Because I keep dropping flags for you. Yeah.
But yeah, the assumption's made just because it's got the word eternal in it.
Well, we've got the word, yeah. So, okay, this is what happens.
Yeah.
You got the word eternal fire, words eternal fire. You got the word torment. We'll take that out of context, put the back together.
There we go.
Eternal torment. Oh, eternal torment in the fire. Whereas
Yeah.
when you put it back in context, no, they're not. In
Yeah.
the narrative, no, it's not. It's not talking about that. And in the meantime, they're not even alluding or citing or talking about Matthew 13, which is explicitly talking about the
Mm.
devil and all the causes of sin, including these
Yeah.
demons. What are they doing? What are they doing in chapter 8? They're causing havoc. They're possessing people.
Yeah.
This apocalyptic worldview has them doing exactly that, causing all
Yeah.
this havoc. Um, so they're the causes of evil that will be destroyed in Matthew 13. We have that explicitly, yeah.
Yeah.
But the traditionalist has this assumption that says um, they know that their final fate will be torment. There's nothing in the text that's telling them that, yeah.
No.
The only way they can do it is just take the bits and pieces out and get weeping and gnashing. And so we'll just take that. We'll go, hey, he's going to be tormented, eternal fire, weeping and gnashing. There you go, ECT.
Yep.
Yeah,
Yep.
that's
Yep.
yeah. So when I get into and I dig down into that, I'm like, no, I'm not really convinced of that. But I'm happy. I'm happy to try and debunk that idea, that assumption. I've had that pushback when I've explained to. I don't even think it was a traditionalist. It was a conditionalist. What might have been a traditionalist. When I said there's nothing in this text that's actually saying that anything about eternal torment, and he said, but they know they're going to go there. And my reply was exactly what I said. Well, how do you know they know? They look uncertain to me. Well, there was this underlying assumption
Mm-hmm.
that the demons knew what was going
Knew what
on.
was
In
waiting.
this
Yeah.
story, they don't. And Piper admits that. So I'm going to go with that and go, they're not
Yeah.
omniscient. It's not part of our
Happy
normal
with that.
theology. They're not God. It's not part of the text. It's not part of the narrative. They don't know. It hasn't been revealed. And they
Mm.
don't know what's going on. They know something might be coming, maybe. But in this narrative, no. And the whole narrative itself is set up for their final defeat, as you see in other parts of Matthew. So it all works against it.
Yeah. Yeah. Definitely. And they are destroyed. They're sent into the waters with the pigs, and that's the last we hear of them, at least
Well,
in that
in the
story.
story, yeah.
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 In that story. So it's
But if you
yeah.
take the apocalyptic worldview I'm talking about,
Mm.
um, that is not going, there has to be some idea of defeat. I think the traditionalists should recognize that as well. It's just what kind of defeat. So you look to
Mm.
Matthew, where is it? Where does he describe clearly what that defeat looks like? Yeah.
I
And
find it
it's
interesting.
Matthew.
Yeah, sorry, I just find it interesting that it's not a connection I've made until recently. When we're talking about apocalyptic language, the sea is quite an apocalyptic image, and we see that in Revelation a lot. But also
Yeah.
the understanding of the sea, the idea that God is the only one that can calm the sea. That's from the Psalms.
Okay, yeah.
And then you've got this idea that the sea is a place of evil. We've got the sea gives up her
Yeah.
dead in
Yeah.
Revelation. It's a place that will be conquered. So it's quite natural for demons
Yeah.
to go back into, at least natural in the sense of this
Yeah.
worldview, this
Yeah.
apocalyptic worldview where demons
Yeah.
they're headed back to the place where they belong, in
Something
one sense.
chaotic. And
Yeah.
you just triggered something within a thought in my mind where back where they were on the boat and you got a storm and that chaos
Mm,
and Jesus he's asleep. For goodness sake, they're going to die, but he's asleep.
yeah.
Maybe I'll go back and have a look if there's any connections with that chaotic sea. There's a
Yeah.
storm, chaotic sea, and some apocalyptic imagery or something like that, because that would only strengthen what I'm talking about. Now, if that
Yeah.
were the case, and you've got Matthew here now, and you've got Matthew here
Mm-hmm.
having Jesus on the sea, and he's not perturbed by that at all. He's like, oh yeah, whatever. And he just calms the storm.
And can control it. Yeah.
He's got that lordship
Yep.
over
He's
there.
got that
So
authority.
way back, way back, where the Satan is saying, look, I'll tempt you to if you just bow down to worship me, right? And he says, oh, yeah, okay, no, and I'll quote scripture and show you how bad you are.
Yeah.
The devil flees from here. Here's Jesus in that very chaotic space, actually calming it
Oh
with that
yeah.
authority.
Yeah.
That's
Yeah. And I think
apocalyptic.
it is, and I think it's huge with the connection of calming the sea and then sending the demons back into the sea.
Yeah, yeah,
It's like the image of him controlling what is chaotic of both nature, but also this realm. And you start to see these symbols. I mean, I'm digging into Revelation on the website through text and reading these commentaries and starting to see these symbols throughout. And it's huge. That's a huge connection between God is in control, obviously, but the symbolism that's through this and the way Matthew has constructed this narrative as well, to go, look, this Jesus not only controls nature, but the nature that we see as chaos itself, he is controlling that. And look, he even sends the demons that are part of this chaos back into this water that is controlled.
So you just said a key phrase, the way Matthew has constructed this narrative. Yeah. That's key. That's key to understanding Matthew. The problem that we were talking before, when we were talking about inspiration, as the doctrine of inspiration leads conservative evangelicals to literalize aspects of the Bible. That sometimes makes them forget that, or they're reluctant to admit that Matthew had a certain level of autonomy in writing his own narrative. Now, if they want to push back and say, well, it's really just God, it's not that. Well, God is using Matthew's genius, literary genius. But
just
he's
like he did
clearly,
with John.
He's clearly creating a different kind of narrative here. He's doing something different with the source material. God could be entirely superintending it, but it's still there before you. It's still a whole narrative. So basically, this is the idea. What I'm looking at is that how that narrative is constructed and what is said in that own context. For itself. Now, if I've still got to go back and go, okay, is there connections with, Jesus on the sea and it's chaotic, where that leads back to in apocalyptic or other chaotic images
recently
from other.
In Psalms. It's definitely in Psalms. I have to look back on it.
But is that apocalyptic? Is that the same?
I see, right,
yeah. I can't just assume it just because I like that theory. I've got to go back.
No, that's true. Isn't that how exegesis works? I like that idea. Oh, okay.
Well, you composite a thesis and you develop it and you explain. It isn't all going to be about apocalyptic. There's going to be other themes. There's going to be he's a messianic, Jewish messianic figure. There's other figures. There's other images that are brought in here. It's not purely apocalyptic, but there is that very definite worldview. And what you've done there is start to think, okay, how does that connect? I love that when someone goes, oh, and they're starting to get, I know you're getting the text. I know you're getting what Matthew's trying to say. It might not be the same in Matthew or Mark. Or it might. It might be unpacked in different ways.
They're all trying to show Jesus in light of what they've witnessed, but also in light of the scriptures. So they're going to build this in, and I think the allusions there are just so strong to other passages that it's fascinating stuff. We could go on for another hour just looking at that.
We're actually at the end. That's the end.
Yeah, that's the end of chapter 8. Yeah,
we could go on. I mean,
we could go on.
Say the same things over and over again.
Yeah, that's good.
But I have to apologise. Well, I have to apologise earlier on. I wrote these notes mainly a few weeks ago, then added my the last bit last night, so I wasn't perfectly fluent through that. So I apologise to the listeners. But what I do want to echo is if anyone wants to jump online and talk to me about this, you and me, please do. Oh, Darren, you said this and this, or you alluded to a verse, you didn't unpack it clearly. I will do so. Because in each exchange I have, I get more and more clarity for myself. And part of this, the reason I'm doing this, Philip, is I'm using you as part of my research. as you discuss it, I'm learning something. So, and you're coming up with some new stuff. The concluding thoughts really is that we've just addressed some hodgepodge or not hodgepodge, but just some random comments that is made here that traditionalists might use, weeping and gnashing or out of darkness, even the torment one here, or the spiritual, let the dead bury the dead. Traditionalists will use those, but to combat other things I might say about Matthew. But I think I'm confident that in each case we can show from Matthew that it's not really supporting even their case, but it's very supportive of CI and what I want to say about Matthew overall.
Yeah. Yeah, and just to conclude on that as well, there may be verses of ambiguity, but we let the more clear verses speak into that ambiguity, and overall, we can see that CI has a stronger
Yeah.
hold here.
Yeah, you
Um,
notice that I do that with Matthew 10:28, and I've done that specifically with Matthew 13:40 to 42 here.
yeah,
I'm not going outside. Well, I do go outside to get outside Matthew to get an idea what things might mean.
hmm
For instance, with the weeping and gnashing of teeth, that is very valid because you're looking at every other instance that means this, and so you would have a sui generis. I think I said that right, but a new usage by Matthew. Now that's
yeah,
not impossible, but you have to explain that from Matthew why that is so. Um, but mostly what I'm trying to do is get back into Matthew. So I go to where Matthew is unambiguous about the destruction of something and use that to help describe what's happening in Matthew 8. You'll see I'm doing that a lot. The reason I can do that, even though we haven't discussed it, is because I've written on it, and I can go through Matthew 28. I said 10:28 and 13. Chapter 13, I've written a lot more too now,
mm,
and there's a lot of allusions to Daniel just in that little section.
yeah.
So we will unpack that, and that'll be a really long session because if you think that just that
Prepare for
one
that. Get
word,
a couple of drinks in.
it's like when we did Matthew 3:12. You think that one word katakaya does it?
Mm,
It's just one thing of that
yeah,
verse. Within Matthew 13, there's a whole lot of issues going on there that really speaks to one statement that everything is burned up. Yeah.
yeah. We'll get there.
Yeah.
It'll be good. Cool. Well, thank you to those who've hung on with us
Did we have
for
many?
an hour 52. I'm not sure. Sometimes the numbers aren't clear. At one point we had 7. We've had people with an average watch time of 20 minutes who've sort of dropped in and out. But if you watch this on catch up, thank you. Please do feel free to comment. Do keep my comments open on Twitter at the Hell Proj. Someone else had the Hell Project, so I had to take off ECT at the end. Hey, there we go. So yeah, just get in touch. Obviously you might have noticed doing a lot less on this channel. I do enjoy these conversations greatly, so Darren and I will continue to go through the Gospel of Matthew. On the Hell Project Online, I'm going through Revelation slowly, but I am getting there. There's just so much in there, so I'm going through that slowly. But ultimately, a lot of my time is now on my new channel, criticalwitness.uk, or youtube.com/criticalwitness, where I talk a lot more broadly about other topics with a good friend of mine. And we interview other people about different topics. So if you want to subscribe to Critical Witness, you'll see me there more. We don't talk about hell as often, though we have had a couple of guests bring it up, and we have had at least one guest who's an annihilationist. We also had Dr. Glenn Peoples on for one of our conversations as well. So do go over to that and subscribe. We'd love to see you over there. But Darren, thank you for spending time. I greatly enjoy these conversations, and we have had at least one viewer still to the end. Thank you, 1920s, for joining us. You've held
Thank you.
through the whole time. We appreciate you letting us know that you're there as well. So Darren, thanks, and we'll see you in a couple of weeks' time. If you want to hang on, when I've ended the stream, we'll figure out a date and get it online.
Indeed.
Cool. Thanks everyone for watching. Take care.
All right.